The year is 1944, and the Allies are attempting to push through some of the fiercest defenses the Germans have put up during the entire war. After months of grueling combat and heavy losses, they stand at the doorstep of victory. But it's not easy. The outcome of this fight will affect the rest of the war. It will change the balance of power in Europe forever. Can our heroes prevail? Today we are going to be taking a look at one of the most brutal battles of World War II, the fight for Monte Cassino. The Allies were engaged in 4 separate battles from Monte Cassino. Each of these phases was characterized by fierce fighting and heavy losses. So let's take a look at each of them individually. The first phase of the battle began on September 13, 1943, with an Allied airborne assault on the monastery and its surrounding heights. The objective was to secure a defensible position from which the Allies could launch their long-awaited campaign to liberate Rome. However, the situation quickly turned into a disaster as the Germans were prepared for the attack and the Allies suffered heavy casualties. By nightfall, over 600 men had been killed or wounded. Despite being forced to withdraw from their initial positions, the Allies managed to establish a foothold on the western slopes of the mountain. General Lucas K. McClear, commanding the U.S. troops in the area, ordered his men to hold their ground despite the mounting casualties. This decision proved costly as the Allies were unable to dislodge the Germans from the mountain. For 2 weeks, the Allies fought to gain just a few hundred yards, suffering heavy casualties in the process. The German defenders, meanwhile, were well entrenched and had a clear view of the battlefield, making it nearly impossible for the Allies to advance without heavy losses. During this phase, there were several close calls for some of the most prominent American leaders. Major General Mark Clark, who later became a general of the Army and Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, was nearly captured by the Germans. He was in a staff car with 3 other officers when their vehicle broke down near the front lines. They were spotted by a German machine gun nest and came under fire. Clark and his companions took cover behind a rock and watched as the Germans advanced on their position. Thinking fast, Clark grabbed a white handkerchief and tied it to the back of the car's antenna, signaling for a truce. The ruse worked, and the Germans stopped their advance, believing that the Americans were surrendering. Clark and his men then slipped away and made their way back to safety. General Fredendell, who commanded the U.S. 34th and 9th Infantry Divisions, also had a narrow escape when his command post came under attack. He was wounded in the shoulder and back, but refused to evacuate the area, continuing to direct operations despite being in pain. After 2 weeks of fighting, the Allies decided to call a temporary halt to the offensive on October 2, 1943, due to heavy casualties and logistical problems. During this time, both sides dug in and prepared for the next phase of the battle. Phase 2 of the battle began on October 14, 1943, with a massive artillery barrage by the Allies. The goal was to soften up the German defenses and allow the infantry to advance more easily. But once again, the Germans were prepared, and the attack failed to achieve its objectives. Over the next 3 days, the Allies pushed forward, but only a few companies at a time, hoping to avoid the heavy losses of the previous assault. Despite the more cautious approach, the Allies still suffered heavy casualties and made only limited progress. On October 17th, they succeeded in breaking through the German defenses, but only slightly, establishing a bridgehead across the Rapido River and advancing a few hundred yards beyond the riverbank. Once again, both sides settled into new defensive positions and prepared for the next phase of the battle. As winter approached, the Allies continued their attacks on Monte Cassino. But the harsh weather conditions made it difficult for the troops to maneuver and fight effectively. Despite the challenges, the Allies pressed on, determined to capture the mountain. In January 1944, the Allies launched a major offensive along the entire Italian front, including Monte Cassino. The attack was part of an effort to break through the German lines and advance toward Rome. The offensive involved hundreds of thousands of troops and was supported by heavy artillery and air power. Despite the size of the attack, the Germans were able to contain the offensive, inflicting heavy casualties on the Allies. Once again, the Allies were forced to withdraw to their starting positions. But this time, something had changed. The Allies had suffered enough, and were beginning to question whether capturing Monte Cassino was even worth the cost. The Germans, meanwhile, were feeling confident and believed that they had finally turned the tide of the war in their favor. However, the Allies were not ready to give up. They regrouped and prepared for one final assault on the mountain. Phase 4 of the battle began on May 11, 1944, with a massive buildup of troops and supplies. The Allies had brought in thousands of reinforcements and were determined to capture the mountain at all costs. The attack was led by the Polish First Army, which had been brought in to replace the exhausted British troops. The Poles had a reputation for being fearless fighters, and the Allies hoped that they would be able to succeed where the British had failed. The Poles attacked in two columns, one from the east and one from the west, aiming to converge on the abbey from two sides. The attack was supported by a massive artillery barrage, which was designed to destroy the German defenses and allow the infantry to advance more easily. The Germans were taken by surprise and were unable to mount an effective defense against the Polish attack. Within a few hours, the Poles had captured the abbey and the surrounding heights. The German defenders were either killed, captured, or fled the battlefield. The capture of Monte Cassino was a turning point in the Italian campaign. It allowed the Allies to open a second front in southern Europe and march on Rome. The Germans were forced to abandon their defensive positions and retreat northward, where they were eventually defeated and driven out of Italy. The battle for Monte Cassino was one of the most brutal and costly engagements of the Italian campaign, but it was ultimately a decisive victory for the Allies. The battle demonstrated the Polish army's courage and fighting ability, and their contribution to the Allied victory in World War II should not be underestimated. One of the key factors in the Polish army's victory was their determination and fighting spirit. The soldiers had been through years of fighting and training in exile and were eager to prove themselves in combat. They were also well led, with experienced officers who knew how to exploit German weaknesses and take advantage of opportunities. The capture of Monte Cassino opened the door for the Allied advance on Rome, which fell to the Allies in June 1944. The victory also contributed to the overall weakening of German forces in Italy, which eventually led to their withdrawal from the country in 1945. However, the cost of the victory was high. Thousands of Polish soldiers and officers were killed or wounded during the battle, and many more were captured or went missing. Despite the heavy losses, the Polish army's role in the liberation of Monte Cassino and the subsequent advance on Rome was recognized by the Allies. But what do you think? What was the turning point of the battle? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to see more videos about the Italian front, check out the series in the description below. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. See you next time.